Hi, this is Steve Hoskinson, and welcome to the End of Trauma podcast. In our last podcast, we talked about the what's wrong attention. We talked about the negativity bias, that is basically that how our biology becomes disorganized is the reason for our suffering. So, whether it's anxiety, depression, or migraines, all of the symptoms that we have really come down to the way that our biology, our body, is working in a coordinated and efficient manner or not. And so, what I've been doing for the past 20 years or so is helping people, clinicians, therapists, coaches, meditation teachers, begin to see and understand how our systems will be self-organizing. You know, we didn't walk out of our evolution from the late Pleistocene without help, and so we have some tools now for understanding better how to help ourselves feel better, do better, and behave better. And so, in the last podcast, we talked about the what's wrong attention, how we become conditioned to look for what's wrong, and how we are drawn, even without wanting to continue to give ourselves ideas, feedback, emotion that will ultimately continue to keep us stuck. So, in organic intelligence, in this approach, we'll develop ways of becoming unstuck. But first, we had to get a little idea of what the problem is, and the problem is the focus on the problem. So that's in our previous podcast. Check that out if you haven't heard that yet, and go check out the negativity bias. And what I say there and what I indicate there is, although it is pervasive, it's this epidemic, this attention to what's wrong, including in therapy and in trauma healing circles and in therapies in general. They're really focused on the problem. And of course, that makes sense because there is a problem, but the solution is something different, and that's what we're looking at here in organic intelligence. So today we're going to begin to look at some of the pathways of the solution. If we're going to climb that trauma mountain, if we're going to climb the and scale the peaks of what's wrong, if we're going to really try to get to the peak of solutions, then we need the right preparation. We need a good Sherpa, a good guide. We need the right tools, and we need a certain conditioning. We need a learning process, and we need a conditioning process to get in shape. And so by the end of this podcast, I'm going to point you to some exercises. We'll develop a program to help you incorporate these exercises so that you can get your neurobiology in shape a little bit, and we're going to give you tools and provide you some guidance over time that will help you to have a different experience and really free yourself from suffering, from discomfort, and hopefully from pain that is unnecessary. But before that, I want to talk about why. Why are we doing this? And the reason is fairly simple. In part, it's because I'm a gardener. I like to watch things grow. And so I've grown this organization called Organic Intelligence and grown this method. I've taught thousands of therapists and launched careers around the world of people who are teaching these ideas and those who are continuing to learn and deepen with me in these healing notions of organic intelligence. They're important because they're not primarily psychological theories. They're theories and practices that are based in science. They're based in the science of psychology. They're based in the science of biology. They're based in the science of developmental psychology, and they're based really in what is known as complexity science. And so I'm going to give you some ideas from complexity science today, and we're going to look at some of the initial conditions. And initial conditions are important because the direction that you start, how you understand your compass, really determines where your journey ends. So we're going to see how we really set our compass and reset a compass that has been demagnetized. And this inner compass then that we develop will help us know which direction that we need to move to and into which direction we want to go. So with those initial conditions set, we'll have a better chance of scaling that mountain and getting to our destination together. And that really begins again to ask this question, why? Not just how we're going to get there, but why do we want to get there? And the reason is the enjoyment. E.O. Wilson, Pulitzer Prize winning author and psychobiologist, wrote a book called Biophilia. And he says part of what is most essential in us is really the love of life. And this love of life is one of the essential movers of our existence. So why would we develop and why would we spend time working on these problems from organic intelligence? And the reason is because we care about life. We want to see and we want to enjoy with one another other people's success. And again, we'll think of this as sort of, enlightened self-interest, because it is enjoyment. It is the pleasure of seeing other people with that smile and that twinkle in their eye. And that enjoyment is part of the reason. And also this, if you look around the world today, we see plenty of struggle, plenty of conflict. The nature of violence and the cycles of violence are of untold dimensions right now. And so our world is in need, and many people that come into our training, which is called the Human Empowerment and Resiliency Training, it's an acronym, is HEART. And many people that come into our training come in because they want tools for helping. And the clinical approach, the organic intelligence clinical approach that therapists use, is a systems approach, which means that by understanding how a system works, we can work with all kinds of systems. So in the training, the Human Empowerment and Resiliency training that happens around the world, this training helps therapists, coaches, and others that are helpers, body workers, to understand how the biology works, how the human physiology works, and how to intervene and support the systems that want to heal themselves. But that understanding of how that biology works is the understanding of how any complex system works. So that complex system may be a client and our human biology, or that system may be a family system, a couple, for instance, that's a system. Another system could be a community, or it could be a nonprofit organization. So people who come into our HEART trainings, the Human Empowerment and Resiliency Training experience, it's a retreat, and it is a place where people develop themselves by developing the art of intervention, how to support a system in its own impulse toward evolution and organization. And so we are finding many people coming into our trainings who really want to help society, help on a larger scale. And it's that larger scale framework that is something that we work well with because we understand complex systems here at Organic Intelligence. So people begin to work with us, but we find that burnout is a real issue. That is, people become passionate about helping life on the planet and see desperate needs. And there are desperate needs. If you look at the refugee crisis out of Syria, if you look at border crisis along the border of the United States with Mexico, if you see healthcare crises, you see cycles of violence, the Me Too movement is pointing again to the epidemic of abuse, systemic oppression, the ways that, for instance, in the United States, the failure of Reconstruction has happened, racial bias, gender bias, the whole range of systemic oppression is happening. And people who care come into our trainings, and we support then their evolution. And we support their evolution based on the notion that sustainability is the key. We don't have the luxury, I don't think anymore, of allowing ourselves to become burned out, to have, say, compassion fatigue. But we understand in organic intelligence how to support one another and how to support ourselves to create a self-sustaining and a self-creating and evolving system that can grow in its ability to have a source of energy, a source of inspiration that is a fountain of limitless energy that is sustainable and continually sourced from a place of creative engagement. And so the why of our work is that we want to empower those who really care about life on the planet to have a sustainable and strategically important and meaningful engagement in the world. So our intervention and our strategy is to create a community of support in organic intelligence. And from that community of support, we're going to help one another remind ourselves about the basis of this sustainable intervention. So sustainability is a very, it's an increasingly popular concept. And from organic intelligence standpoint, we have an idea of and methods that have been developed over a period of 20 years, really of how to create sustainable and strategic connection and intervention on behalf of life on the planet. So if we are able to empower you, you then, from this fountain of abundance of energy, will then support life on the planet. And that's our strategy. Our aim is to support life on the planet by supporting your support for life on the planet. All right? So that creates a pretty nice environment altogether, and we have a nice community of people that are really interested in connecting, and that's the why. So understanding now why we're doing it, let's talk a little bit more about the how. So the how of this process is dependent on the understanding of what the problem is. So the problem, of course, is the what's wrong attention and the way that our attention reinforces states and experiences that ultimately are continuing to send disorganizing signals into our biology. So what we need to do then is begin to think about a different approach, and this different approach is then the sourcing of what we would think of as the initial conditions. And our initial conditions are important. The notion here is from chaos theory, if you've heard of the butterfly effect. Our human systems are sensitive to initial conditions. And that's again this idea that if you were working from, say, the use of a compass, and you begin to say a 10-mile hike, and you're going to go in a straight line on your 10-mile hike, and so if you point your if you intend to walk due north, but if you're only a couple of degrees off at the beginning, by the time you get to the end of your 10-mile hike, you'll be miles and miles away from your destination, because the first few steps you'll only be inches off course. But then after 100 yards, you'll be many yards off course, because you go further and further off course the further you walk. So getting that compass set and getting the first few steps correct makes all the difference in the world. So our first steps are really key. And if you've ever used a spinning top, if it or if you've ever seen a basketball player spin a basketball on their finger, once that begins to wobble, it's very difficult to get it back spinning very smoothly. But if you begin with a smooth spinning, it'll continue to move quite smoothly. Our initial conditions are based in the understanding of this new sort of neurobiological understanding, not only of the importance of good work. Most therapies will say if you do the right things, you'll feel better. You put in your 10,000 hours, you make good habits. But that all requires work. I work with veterans a good bit, and the veterans are coming back, say, from different war conditions with influences and insults, post-traumatic stress disorder from combat, from accidents, from improvised explosive devices and traumatic brain injury, a whole host of problems, and then they are put through protocols for working with post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of these include protocols in which they are asked, what's the worst thing that happened? And they're asked to repeat and reiterate what the problem was. These are called exposure protocols. And there is decent research around the efficacy of these protocols. But from the organic intelligence standpoint, we have a very different approach, because we have an approach that says we want to begin with strength, stabilization, and support. Strength, stabilization, and support. Because our biology will understand how to self-heal if we give it the feedback that it's looking for. And the good news in all of this is that your system and mine is all the time bringing us good support. And so these initial conditions are the ways that we prime ourselves, prepare ourselves to receive the information that is going to be needed by our physiology to heal itself. These initial conditions begin with something that's quite different, again, from what's normally taught in therapy or meditation or mindfulness. In our heart training, the human empowerment and resiliency training, we begin with what I call a couple of pillars. There are 3 pillars for the human empowerment and resiliency training, and they are mindfulness, compassion, and the OI, the Organic Intelligence Clinical Protocol, how to intervene. But the beginning is mindfulness, and the mindfulness has a very specific and physiologically oriented approach. The mindfulness begins with the understanding and the experience of connecting to the environment through the senses. That is, we begin to do something different. We begin to bring the attention away from the interior experience, away from the experience of the attention to, say, emotion or sensation or image or any of the interior aspects of the experience, or to thought. That's another place where many of us are spending a lot of energy. We bring our attention away from these interior elements of experience and bring our attention into the exterior world. We connect to the environment through the senses, right? Because that is a key to mindfulness. If my system that is somehow disoriented and disconnected or suffering, it is suffering often unnecessarily because programs that are important for survival, like fight and flight and freeze, are creating emotion and sensation that is often quite uncomfortable. Those are echoes from the past. But in the present moment, if I'm in a fairly comfortable and safe environment, really my biology should be sending me signals of comfort, safety, and even enjoyment. So if my system is sending me irrelevant signals, it's like the smoke detector of the brain. The amygdala is is going off when there's no smoke, no fire. An antidote for that then is to stop paying attention to the smoke detector, right? If you're in a meeting, or if you're having lunch with friends and you're in your own kitchen, and then the smoke detector goes off, and you know, oh, it's going off because the battery is a problem or it's just malfunctioning, then it would be inappropriate for everybody every 5 minutes when the smoke detector goes off to jump up, leave the meal, and head outside. Instead, you say, okay, I'm sorry, you guys, the smoke detector's a problem, it'll go off in a couple of minutes. And you basically then ignore that signal if it's irrelevant. The same thing happens in our own neurobiology. The same thing happens in the amygdala in our brain. That is, the smoke detector's going off, but no smoke, no fire. So, if there's no smoke, no fire, no immediate threat, then we want to give our system a different signal. We want to listen to something else other than the smoke detector. That is connecting to the environment through the senses. And really, it's very simple. We just call it coming back to our senses. And it's a practice of simply, being a little bit more Zen-like. I put my Zen hat on and I start seeing what I see. I start hearing what I hear. I start using the tactile sense to feel the texture, say, of the fabric underneath my fingers. And I come back to my senses. And this gives my brainstem, my brainstem, a chance to actually assess, oh yeah, and say, oh yeah, there's actually no need for that alarm to be happening. No need to pay attention to the smoke detector that's firing right now. And instead, I'm going to be looking out my window and I'm going to see the clouds out there. I'm going to see the hillsides. I'll see the trees. I'll see the wind blowing in the trees. Now, we want to practice this over time. So this practice and all the practices of organic intelligence are effective because they are the tools that catalyze, that ride the waves of how our biology works. Our biology wants to and needs to map itself in its current environment. So there's a process in the brain that basically maps our inner experience. So by helping my system do its natural thing, by getting our Google Maps of the brain established, we're doing several things. We're riding the wave of what our biology would do naturally. We're just helping. We're helping our body, helping our physiology, helping our neurobiology do what it does naturally. And that natural function is to map us in our environment. And so by being able to simply come back into connection to the environment through the senses, by seeing what we see, hearing what we hear, practicing coming back to our senses, we help ourselves, our biology, map ourselves in the environment, very natural, and we also interrupt the attention that would be paying attention to what's wrong. If you want more information on the what's wrong attention, this negativity bias, look into the previous podcast, which is called the what's wrong attention in the age of disintegration. Now, the antidote for that will be to attend to the exterior environment for a while. And the reason for this is that by supporting our natural inclination toward orientation, I can help the mapping and I can interrupt the cycles of activation of the fight, flight, and freeze system. Right? If there is no threat, no fire, I want to bring my attention into the here and now, beginning with where I am in this moment. So part of that will mean that I send my attention into and focus into just seeing. And in just seeing, it's seeing the physical properties of something. So in this moment, I'm looking at a mantle over a fireplace, and it's a wood mantle. And so I'm going to notice the physical properties of the mantle. And so right now, I'm noticing the color, and it's sort of a tan. I notice the places on the wood where there are little eyes. I notice the shape, and I notice the way that the light shines off of it, and it suggests that it's smooth also. So I'm noticing its physical characteristics, and I'm just, in this Zen-like fashion, just noting it. Now, when we do this, there is a tendency to then evaluate this. There is a tendency then to put it in a couple of categories. Our whole emotional system derived from the basic movement of really primitive organisms like a paramecium. Even a single cell organism does this. It will do approach avoidance. So the basis of our need of understanding is this good, something I can approach or something I can hang out with, or is it a threat, something I need to move away from or handle as a kind of threat? So that's an approach avoidance framework. And our often immediate inclination is to say, oh, it's good, it's bad, I like it, I don't like it. It's a approach topic, or it's an avoid topic. We're going to do something different, because we're going to come out of that approach avoidance paradigm not by saying, oh, is it good, is it bad, but simply, what is? Not what is it like, but what is it? And I'm going to try to see things as they are. And that's orientation. The mindfulness aspect of that is, if I don't have that level of connection to the environment, then I have some level of disorientation. So this will take practice. And at the end of this podcast, I'll do a little practice with you to help along the way. And we'll be creating an entire program for the end of trauma, where you can gain more and more skills and practices on this. But it's very simple. At the beginning, connecting to the environment through the senses is orientation, is mindfulness. And I will notice that I may have a tendency to say, oh, I like it, or now I'm going to look for something I like. That's not really the goal. The goal is just to connect with the environment in a neutral fashion. That is, just to let the senses open a bit, so I can see what I see, I can hear what I hear, I smell what I smell, I taste what I taste, I feel the texture of things and the tactile sense of sensing that way. And we'll begin to practice this process of interrupting the what's wrong attention. Interrupting that feedback that says, oh, there's something wrong, by saying, oh, what is? Not what's wrong, but what is. That's orientation. That's the beginning of our mindfulness. Now, this work on ourselves is necessary, not just to feel better, but to then prepare ourselves ultimately for the work of reordering our nervous system by understanding and getting support from, say, someone who understands that the problem actually is not psychological but physiological. So again, the therapists that I've trained over the years are trained to understand that the problem is not psychology, it's not trauma, it's not anything other than the way that our system becomes disordered or desynchronized. The last Nobel Prize in medicine was won by people who studied these timing cells, these cells that understand about timing and the way that our biology works together. If you've heard of biorhythms or circadian rhythms, our biology works and exists as an organism because it does this thing called biosync. It does biosynchrony, and organic intelligence sessions, as a kind of interpersonal biofeedback process, finds where the biology is trying to resync itself, where it's trying to reorient organize itself. Well, like a car, that you take in and then you're going to get a tune-up. That means that all the pistons are firing at the same time. And we do almost exactly that same thing with human beings and human biology, because organic intelligence practitioners are trained to see how that biology is trying to resynchronize its own work. And we're trained to see those signs of support coming in through image and sensation and orientation and meaning and feeling, right? That through any of those channels can come these little signals of support. Mostly, what we're trained to do is pay attention to what's wrong, pay attention to activation, pay attention to discomfort. And as a mindfulness dialogue that I'm having with meditation communities, we're looking for something a little different. That is, we're looking for the signs of support. And orientation is one way to begin to help our system become less fascinated by what's wrong and more interested and available to what is. And that primes us for then being able to listen to the what would we say, like the music in the chaos. So when you're listening, say, in your headphones, if you're on a subway, you might have to turn up the volume a little bit. If you're listening on a phone, say, to your favorite music, and you're driving, say, through a construction zone, you have to turn up the volume. It's sometimes hard to hear the music for all the noise. And the what's wrong attention is paying attention to the noise. And what we're beginning to do is to train ourselves to filter out that noise so we can hear the music. And the music that we are training ourselves to hear will be those signals of pleasure. And by pleasure, we're going to be talking about simple human pleasure that is our birthright, our experience of goodness that should really be arising every moment is really important. And we are going to be needing some help to begin to tune and train our attention to look for those signals of support that are coming from our biology all the time. All the time those things are coming. But the what's wrong attention really has us in a jam. I always think of the Sistine Chapel when I think of this. And in the Sistine Chapel, there's the depiction of God just hanging over a cloud, trying to reach the human being below, right? And so God is bending over, just leaning over the clouds, and the angels are holding on to God, going, God, you're gonna fall off your cloud. And God's like, hey, no, I got to get to this human being down here, and he's reaching down toward the human being, and the human being is sort of like, oh, sort of almost has a remote control in one hand, and then absent-mindedly is sort of raising a finger up toward God a little bit, like, I can hardly be bothered. It's sort of a Homer Simpson moment, but that's really our condition here. So all the time, this message of giftedness and blessing and human goodness and grace is coming toward us, and it's almost like, we can't figure out what direction that's in. So we're going to sort out what direction that is by beginning with orientation, and then this orientation to simple human pleasure. Simple human pleasure, those things that begin to feel better for us. And we have a whole protocol for being able to deepen in that, because pleasure can be addiction, right? In the previous podcast, I talked about the hazard of negative reinforcement, which is our attention is so attracted to what's wrong because it becomes addicted to the intensity of it. Like, what doesn't feel good, when it feels better, addicts me. That is, When I feel discomfort, activation, unpleasantness, negative emotion, I feel that, and then when it feels better, the intensity decreases, and it then reinforces this idea that the way to feel better is by feeling worse first. That's negative reinforcement. We have been hoodwinked by this. We've been hoodwinked by the notion that the way to feel better is by feeling worse first. We don't think that. We don't think that way. We're trying desperately to get out of that, but it's a conditioning process, so it's a non conscious process. I have to counteract that. I have to counteract that negative reinforcement. I have to find an antidote for that negative reinforcement that says the way to feel better is by feeling worse first. So, organic intelligence is offering this shift, this paradigm change in the way of healing, the way that therapy works, and in particular, how trauma therapy should work by looking to develop over time this gradual approach of the subtlety of positive reinforcement. It's the way our biology wants to work, but we have been so trapped by negative reinforcement that we are disoriented. So, our work of orientation is first connecting to the environment through the senses. That begins to, to diminish the power of negative thinking. It diminishes the power of that negativity bias of the what's wrong attention, and begins to give us some different chance where we can begin to feel something different. This orientation to pleasure is not big pleasure, it's simple human pleasure. So we'll define it like this. So it's simple human pleasure, just simple goodness that is not too intense, not substance related, non addictive, and can be really experienced and felt. If you think of part of the reason we're looking at this is because the synchrony that we're looking for is the synchrony that is even basically represented in child rearing. If you're looking at the research these days on attachment theory, for instance, the currency of human bonding is pleasure. Now, politicians are playing on us, and advertisers in the media, they're playing on us by telling us, oh, you need this, and this is what's wrong. Oh, it's scary, or this is the axis of evil, or this is the problem. And that stimulates the negative reinforcement of activation, and we begin to, in the ways that then activates our fight, flight, and freeze processes, these survival programs, these states of negative emotion, that says that the relationship that I need is alliance. Okay, so let's get together with people like us. Let's get the red states and together, and let's get the red the people that agree with the Republicans together, and the people that agree with the Democrats together, or the activists who say it should work in a certain way, right? We are drawn together and we form alliances. That's not really basic human bonding. That's an artifact of this age of disintegration. Human bonding. Watch a happy baby with mom that's enjoying their company together. That's positive feeling. And this positive feeling and this pleasurable emotion, that's the currency of human bonding. That's the glue that really creates us, because we as a human species are fundamentally and most basically relational. We grew up in our evolutionary past as tribal beings. Our biology expects relationship. It expects safety, not by alliance, but by affiliation, by the pleasure of connecting. And so we connect first. We prime for this. We prepare for this by just connecting with neutral environment. And then we take a next step by repeatedly giving ourselves the experience of pleasant emotion, pleasant sensation, pleasant thought. We feed ourselves good, solid soul food. Many of us are really trying to improve our diet. We're trying to eat well, it's pretty simple, right? It's like eat vegetables. That's, that we know the condition. It's a better diet is better, and we try to not eat pesticides, right? So you might find organic foods, and you're trying to bring ourselves really good food. And so, in the same way, we want to bring ourselves the good nutrition of our psychology. Our psychology. So, what do I take in visually? What sensations do I pay attention to? How can I connect to the environment through the senses? So, in a neutral way, just what is, how can I really begin to think and have thoughts that are more supportive, healthy thinking? How can my emotions then begin to nurture me, right? So we're beginning to look then at this second pillar of, say, the heart training, which is compassion. How can I cultivate compassion for myself and others? And we'll do this by evoking and invoking images and sensations and thoughts and feelings that are connected with feeling better. And then holding the attention there for just a little bit and then coming back to orientation. Our basic emotional impulse is curiosity, is learning, is engagement, is pleasure. This Pulitzer Prize winning author, E.O. Wilson, who says our basic inclination is love of life. It's love. I mean, we don't even have to say that too much, right? We know what's most basic. We know what's most real. What is the center of it all? It is love. And how can then we stray so far? It's not a characterological problem. It's not a psychological problem. It's a biological issue. To be able then to hone in on and practice this experience of affection, of warmth, of empathy, of caring, we will again develop an entire program for you for this, but we need to practice, and we want to practice it often, this experience of pleasure. And E.O. Wilson, as well as talking about biophilia, looked at our human species, and he looked at our sense receptors, and he said, we are made for pleasure. We're made for pleasure, tactile pleasure, sensual pleasure, just the pleasure of existence. This is one of our most basic fundamentals of human experience. And we are seriously underpleasured. We are seriously anhedonic, really is the term for it. And through no fault of our own, right? This has all been laid upon us. It's been conditioned. But this also is the good news, because as much as we have been conditioned, say, to suffer or to work hard, we substitute for genuine human pleasure the satisfaction of getting things done, right? Of working. Organic intelligence says it is absolutely, from a neurobiological level, it is absolutely as essential to understand turning things off, to unplug, and to experience pleasure and the pleasure of ease. The cultivation of enjoyment, the cultivation of the feeling of enjoyment is really key, and of not working too hard. The brain's default mode, there is this integrative mode of the brain, and the resting process is absolutely key. So the work, our mantra in organic intelligence says the job is enjoyment. And literally there is enjoyment, a feast for the senses everywhere. Martin Luther said this. Martin Luther said, if we could but see a grain of wheat, we would go mad with wonder. Right? If we could but see a grain of wheat, we would go mad with wonder. The opportunities for pleasure, for enjoyment, for engagement, for healthful, wholesome enjoyment are literally at our fingertips every day. And yet we are distracted and disoriented. There is an alternative. And the alternative is important, because, as you know, it seems every day the balance of our well-being is at a critical point. The world's ecosystem is is on a precipice of disaster. The cycles of violence are perpetuating and growing. Refugees, the problems are well known. The solution is not to work harder, it is to find the path of easeful joining, especially in pleasure. The Caucasian mystic G.I. Gurdjieff said this. He said, "It is better to temporarily be an egotist than never to be just." It is better to temporarily be an egotist than never to be just. And how organic intelligence, how I'm understanding that is that for a time we have to turn ourselves and dedicate ourselves to enjoyment and pleasure because our neurobiology has been twisted by the notion not only of hard work, which it is, hard work, but also the what's wrong attention. Right? We've got to create a balance. We have to create the yin to that yang of imbalance. And we're not talking about now distraction, right? We're not talking about just getting away from our problems, but it would be enjoying. How can I take distraction into an actual experience of enjoyment? How can I savor pleasure, right? And it's everywhere. Every decent meal that I have, every glance toward the clouds, every sunset, every rising of the sun, every moment of seeing something as simple as a grain of wheat, the smile in a friend, the twinkle of an eye, the thought of someone who has loved me in the past. All of those can evoke a state that is quite pleasurable. And if we are successful in building our strength in pleasure, then we are going to begin to grow our capacity to feel intensity. Believe it or not, the experience of pleasure is like beginning your workout, and it's lifting that 2-pound dumbbell. Right? It's just beginning really easily. The path of ease is our path of growth. And this we'll talk about more as we continue on this process of organic intelligence. But we begin very easily because the risk is doing too much. And by doing too much, you leave the positive reinforcement framework and go to negative reinforcement. And as soon as you're in the negative reinforcement, then the message of negative reinforcement gets reinforced, which is the way to feel better is by feeling worse first. And that's what keeps us stuck. By easing ourselves towards simple, wholesome, healthful, non-addictive goodness, and the experience of that in the body, the experience of that is really key. So if your interest is in justice, if your interest is in well-being, if your interest is in growing your capacity in embodiment and feeling and emotional connection and relationship, then we've got to do a lot less. We've got to work less and enjoy more. The job is enjoyment. This is the path of the end of trauma and the new neurobiology, the understanding of the initial conditions that if we begin in a small step and by these little steps grow our capacity to dance. So let's do just a quick exercise here together. Let's practice this orientation to pleasure. I'm going to put up a graphic for you from this podcast, and that graphic will be at one of our maps, and the map is part of the clinical protocol where we are helping see and support the natural evolution of an individual biology, a person, from chaos to complexity, then into coherence and self-organization. But the steps to this depend on our initial conditions, the initial conditions which include this orientation, connecting to the environment through the senses, this compassion, this kindness, this intention of kindness for oneself and ultimately for others as well, the growth of that through this pathway of wholesome human pleasure, simple human pleasure. So here's the exercise. Let's begin with this. Now let's just, wherever you are, if you're in a easeful place, if you are in a safe, comfortable place where you don't have to be doing something else like driving or something, then just let your eyes go where they want to go. Just see what they see, and we'll be a little zen-like, we'll be childlike here, beginner's mind, just seeing and just letting your eyes free to look around and to take in what they want to take in. Let them see what they like to see, and just see what you see when you see what you see. Right? Whether that's nearby or far away, whether it is looking to the left or to the right, whether it's up or down, just allowing the eyes freely to enjoy their exploration. And then if there is the enjoyment of exploration, or if your eyes see something that they like in particular, take a moment to savor that enjoyment, just to come inside your experience. And if it's an emotion or if it's a sensation, what is that sensation of pleasure like? See if you can begin to develop that language of sensation of pleasure. Is it a little bit of warmth? Is it spaciousness? Is it peace? Is it kindness? Is it affection or even love? And we notice that for a moment, but just a moment, and then we come back out and see again the world about us. Different or the same? It's a question. That's our beginning exercise. From that little simple step, we will learn the basic dance moves that ultimately will be this tango of enjoyment. Next time on the End of Trauma, we're going to look at game theory and the non-zero sum game. And we're going to look at this as the win-win-win scenario that is key to positive reinforcement in this growth of organic intelligence. Thanks for joining us in this podcast. We'll look forward to next time. Be in touch. If you have questions, if you'd like to inquire about our magnets that will be really helpful on your fridge that says the job is enjoyment, be in touch, and let's continue in this community of support for one another. Positive reinforcement, it's more than just thinking positive or ignoring one's experience. There's growth that's available. Organic intelligence, the End of Trauma.